And joining us now in studio, Iain McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist and author of The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Also want to let you know that producers Sandra Gionis and Daniel Kitts are hosting a live chat right now on the homepage. That's theagenda.tvo.org, so chime in on the live chat or send us a tweet via Twitter, #theagenda, and join the conversation. Iain McGilchrist, great to meet you, and nice to have you here in our studio.
Well, thank you very much for having me along.
We do want to let everybody know that this is part of our special series called Mental Health Matters, which we are premiering today.
Sure.
Every other Tuesday we're doing something on mental health, leading right up to May 7th, when we're going to do a whole week of programs on this issue that you care about so much. And I want to start obviously with this new book that you've written. Almost 500 pages on the various implications of the differences between the two hemispheres in the brain, much of which you want to dispute. Let's put that on the record right here. Many popular misconceptions about those differences.
Yes.
Let's start there. Like what?
Well, for example, one of the misconceptions is that it's about thinking versus feeling, that the left hemisphere thinks and the right hemisphere feels, or that it's about visual imagery in the right hemisphere and language in the left. But in fact, language and visual imagery are subserved by both hemispheres. And both of them are crucially involved in imagination. It's not just one or the other. And it's not true that the left hemisphere is this little hard-nosed thing that's down to earth. It's actually not very down to earth at all. In fact, in some senses, the right hemisphere is more in touch with reality.
Why are you so offside with conventional wisdom on this?
I think what happened was that people got very interested in all this about the 60s and 70s, when the first split brain operations happened in California with Sperry and Bogan. And this led to a popular culture in which people began to bandy around a lot of rather easy ideas. Some of the ones I just mentioned, that the right hemisphere is sort of pink and fluffy and the left hemisphere hard-nosed and logical. And people in neuroscience got so wary of this that they really haven't looked at it since. They found that both hemispheres were involved in everything, which is absolutely correct, and so they thought, well, there's nothing to this anymore.
Well, if this isn't then so much as a debate about what the two hemispheres do, but rather how the two hemispheres do what they do, what are the differences in the left and the right at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, perhaps it would be worth mentioning that they have obvious, observable structural differences, that they're different sizes, weights, shapes, different, if you look at the surface of the brain, different convolutions, the gyri on the surface of the brain are different. They have different architecture to the cells. They respond differently to neurotransmitters. So they're obviously different, and they're divided in this way. And I started to look at what the differences were in birds and animals, because they also have divided brains. And it turns out that this has to do with attention.
Keep going. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think importantly, attention sounds, cognitive scientists often talk as though attention is just another function. But actually it grounds our reality. Things only come into being for us when we attend to them, and how we attend to them changes what it is we find. So it's not just that things out there dictate to us a certain kind of attention that's appropriate to them, that's correct, but also the kind of attention we pay changes what we find when we look there. And in birds and animals, there's a Darwinian explanation for why they have to do two things at once and keep them separate. Can I give you an illustration?
Well, I'm guessing this is eating and trying not to get killed at the same time?
This is it.
Okay.
And
Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there, but that...
this is correct, but I mean, if you think about, the easiest example is to think of a bird trying to pick out a seed against a background of grit. It's got to focus clearly on something that it's already prioritized and knows it wants, and it goes for it and gets it. And, but at the same time, if it's going to stay alive, it's got to have a completely uncommitted, open attention for anything that might exist, including obviously predators. And there's a very good body of knowledge about birds and animals showing that they quite reliably use their left hemisphere, their right eye in most of these creatures, to focus on these detailed things that they want to manipulate. And their left hemisphere, their right eye, their right hemisphere, their left eye, to look out for the broader picture.
Okay, let me move you from animals to humans then. If somebody's had a stroke, what's going on in the brain? What's changed in their brain that obviously prevents them from doing some things that they previously were able to do?
Well, that's a big question, because of course it depends entirely where the stroke is and how extensive it is. But I suppose what you may be getting at is that a lot of the literature that's informative about this comes from studying people who have sustained a stroke or an injury or have a tumor or something in one part of the brain, and we begin to see what it is in their world that goes missing. And this is extremely interesting stuff.
The title of your book is about the relationship between the right and the left hemispheres, the master and his emissary. Which is which?
Well, again, contrary to what people imagine, the master is not the left hemisphere. The master is actually the right hemisphere that is silent. It doesn't have control of speech, but it sees more of the picture and understands more than its emissary, the left hemisphere, that it needs to keep a certain distance from. It needs that left hemisphere to go and do important work on its behalf, and it mustn't get involved in that work. The difficulty is, because this emissary, very bright, very efficient at doing what it does, thinks it knows everything, it doesn't understand what it is that it doesn't know what it is that it doesn't know.
Without the other hemisphere to put it all into context.
Exactly.
And
so there is a progression in all things. The right hemisphere grounds our first experience of something. Then there's an intermediate phase of processing in the left hemisphere. As things become familiar, they get categorized, they get abstracted, they get systematized. But then there is this very important third phase of the return of that information to the right hemisphere, which is able to put it into a global context. And the problem comes that sometimes this process stops with the left hemisphere. And increasingly, I think, our reliance on knowledge that makes us powerful, that comes from being able to dissect the world, makes us think that the left hemisphere knows everything when it clearly doesn't.
But are all the things that we prize, not all the things, is much of what we prize about contemporary Western society based in that left hemisphere?
I mean, everything that we do, of course, is dependent on our whole brain, and I don't want people to run away with the idea that we don't use one part of our brain. Of course we do all the time for everything. But the two hemispheres have styles, takes, if you like, on the world. They see things differently, they prioritize different things, they have different values, and they construct a different version of the world. And what I would say about the modern world is it tends to reflect excessively the products of the left hemisphere's processing of reality, and tends to drive out by marginalizing, undercutting, or pretending that the concepts that the right hemisphere is familiar with just don't exist, because they don't have any meaning to this emissary.
Want to give us a for instance on that?
Well, I think it misunderstands the nature of our embodied existence. It tends to force things into either or, black and white, mind or matter. I think it tends to misunderstand things, everything, which is in fact implicit, intuitive, and these were often some of the most valuable things in any civilization. We know that, broadly speaking, when we communicate, the mass of what we communicate is not actually in the words themselves, that it's in a lot of other things, in the tone of voice, in humor, in irony, in metaphor, in imagination, that needs a contribution from the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere makes things very literalistic, very explicit, and reduces our ability to see things in a skilled, embodied way to algorithms and procedures.
Do we pay a price for being too left hemisphere centered? If that's
well, I consider we pay a very high price.
What's the price?
We may pay the ultimate price because I think it prioritizes the need to have more material resource. It treats the world as a simple resource to be exploited. Its raison d'etre, if you like, is to manipulate. It doesn't really understand the whole picture, it doesn't need to, but it just manipulates well. The right hemisphere sees the whole picture. And if we get too focused on manipulating, what we construct is a world that's very mechanical. We start to see people like machines, and we start to see machines as we attribute attributes that are human to them, which they don't have. And I think this process is extremely damaging. It's causing us to think that we're acting rationally towards certain goals, and then we're surprised when, paradoxically, those goals are not achieved. For example, we pursue happiness, and actually happiness is something that can only come as a byproduct. Actually, most of the great things in life can only come as byproducts. They can't be pursued in the way the left hemisphere thinks it should do. The left hemisphere is the great grasper. It controls the right hand with which we grasp things, and it controls the bits of language, not all of language, but the bits of language with which we pin things down and say we've grasped them.
But you'd like us to be a little more right hemispherically focused, if you like.
It's important to have balance. And sometimes people say to me, well, what would the world be like if the right hemisphere ruled the day? And the answer is extremely balanced, because the right hemisphere knows what it needs, the contribution it needs from the left hemisphere. The master actually sent its emissary on purpose to do certain work. The emissary starts to think that it knows everything and knows better than the master. That is the problem. And so we get locked into a system in which we think we know everything, and we just get to know more about what we already know. We don't branch out. We cut off all the bits that would have given us a hint that there's something else.
You mentioned the word balance there, and I want to just, in our remaining moments here before we ask the others to join us, talk a bit about the ramifications of an imbalanced brain. You gave a lecture at the Gardner Museum last night, which we taped and which we will play on Big Ideas, the TVO lecture series on the 5th and the 6th of May as we lead into our mental health special week. And you said that a number of mental illnesses can be attributed to the imbalances between the right and the left hemispheres. Which illnesses might you be referring to there?
Well, this is controversial stuff, and I don't expect everyone entirely to agree with me. But there are some illnesses, including Asperger's and autism, and anorexia nervosa, which are both characteristically modern conditions, which the evidence suggests are largely dependent on loss of functions which in the normal brain are underwritten in the right hemisphere. So they're like right hemisphere deficiency states, and they seem to be getting commoner. There are arguments about whether they really are or whether we're more aware of them and so forth, and we don't want to go into that whole debate now, but even setting that aside, they probably are on the increase. And schizophrenia, which is associated with, we think it probably only started in the Industrial Revolution, and seems to be more associated with urban cultures, may be another example.
And how do those imbalances which result in those things happen in the first place?
Well, they happen, I think, because we start to see the world in certain ways. People of influence in the culture begin to generate a way of looking at the world that then filters down in a sort of, until it becomes an intuitive way of understanding amongst the people at large. And then this way of thinking generates a world out there. We interact with the world all the time, and as Norman Doidge has pointed out brilliantly, our brains are plastic. They change in response to the environment, but we also create an environment in response to our brain. So the brain and the environment are in dialogue. We start creating a world out there that looks very much like the left hemisphere's world. Then we will start to favor these illnesses. People who have these characteristics, they will be reinforced rather than discouraged. And they may actually be better suited to taking positions of influence in a culture, and they may rise to power, and they themselves perpetuate this way of thinking. It's a subtle process.
Norman will appreciate the plug, and he's going to join us in just a couple of minutes.
I suppose we ought to talk a bit about depression too, I think.
Yeah, we're going to get to it all. You gave an example of a study of Mexican immigrants whose mental health actually worsened the more years they spent in the United States?
Correct.
Explain that to us, because of course the conventional wisdom would be they're away from their problems, they've come to the land of milk and honey, they ought to be better.
That's absolutely right, and it just shows how difficult it is for people to understand that actually material affluence is not the cause of well-being and in a mental sense. In fact, one of my very distinguished professor colleagues, when I reported the data, but there's no doubt about these data that show that people are less happy now than they used to be marginally, although they were very much less well off materially than they are now. He just said, well, it can't be right because they've got televisions and washing machines. But actually, this is not what makes us happy. It turns out that it has very little indeed to do with material well-being. Once your basic needs are covered, the rest is just icing on the cake, and it may actually make things worse. What matters is social interconnectedness, social cohesiveness, trust, and the sense of belonging, having a place where you belong and with other people. And that, of course, social cohesion is gradually being eroded, and I think that, along with the mechanization of our attitudes to human beings, is causing people to feel an emptiness, to feel frustration, and to become anxious that things are out of control, they need to somehow control them, and it gives rise to a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression.
I don't mean this to sound as flippant as I fear it may sound, but are you saying modern, complex, Western societies are bad for our mental health?
I think I'm saying exactly that.
Okay. Then it wasn't as flippant as I feared it would sound.
No, pretty much on target.
I'll take that. Okay, stand by. Appreciate you getting this started. We're going to have a couple of others join us. Up next, we'll open up for debate from our divided brain to the cause of modern mental malaise. Stay with us.
The shame that I held about Phil's illness and about our situation and him being on the street was not my own to have. It was not appropriate. It was not fair. You know, he has a severe mental illness, and people who are on the street who have his forms of mental illness are treated horribly by the majority of people who have no understanding of what's happening.
And joining us now on the line from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Roger McIntyre, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Pharmacology at the University of Toronto. And joining us in studio, the aforementioned Norman Doidge, psychiatrist and the author of The Brain That Changes Itself. And we welcome back author and psychiatrist Iain McGilchrist. Roger, it's good to have you on the program out there from the Rock. I want to start by just sharing with you and our viewers a couple of, I think, important facts to bring to this discussion, and then we'll go from there. Michael, if you would, let's bring these up here. 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental illness at some point in their life. Schizophrenia affects 1%, major depression afflicts 8% of Canadians, and 12% of people suffer from anxiety disorders. That's from CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Those are relatively new numbers. Roger, let's get it started with you, please. There are those who peg the number of people who experience mental illness as being closer to 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3, not 1 in 5, as CAMH suggests. Tell me this, are modern societies producing more mental illnesses than psychiatrists know how to cure?
Well, the question about whether modern societies are producing more mental illness, I think, is really the nub of the issue. And there has been reports from some countries and some regions that the rates of mental illness are on the way up. I think we do have, however, some conflicting evidence. And the way to look at this methodologically, Steve, is you'd want to look at really a longitudinal study. That'd be the ideal way to do it. All things created equal, look at a cohort over multiple decades of follow-up. And as you would expect, that type of effort is very difficult, it's costly, and those types of studies are rare, but they do exist. In fact, one of the studies here in Canada, Stirling County study, named after the Digby County in the southwest corner of Nova Scotia, in fact, is a 60-year longitudinal cohort. And in that study, when they looked at a host of mental disorders, what they found was that the overall rate of depression, one of the topics of focus for today, in fact, did not change at all. It remained pretty consistent, actually, at about 5 to 6% over the last 5 to 6 decades. What's important to highlight, though, is if you look at the overall population, you may miss some of the detail. And that is in some of the subpopulations, those who are perhaps consequenced by some of the social deterioration, whether that be to unemployment, to crime, to lack of religiosity or decreased religiosity, decreased affiliation with family, marital and family breakup, those subgroups had increases in their rates of mental disorders. So I think what to come up with a sort of a broad statement, mental illness is on the way up, it's certainly conflicting in terms of the results, and I don't think all organizations would agree with that. But I think there's plenty of evidence to say that there are subpopulations where there's an increase. And there may be cultural or certainly time-related factors where this hits home. For me, the best example is what's occurring in the United States currently. Last year in the United States of America, there were more veterans who committed suicide than died in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And that's quite a statement, non-specific, but a powerful statement about the mental health of those individuals returning from combat. So again, this obviously is a very high-risk group, but I think there's many lessons for us to learn from these high-risk groups. So I think a general statement difficult to support with empirical evidence, but there's many examples where subgroups have higher risk.
Let me just get Norman to pick up on that last point there. That is a shocking and tragic statistic, that there are more vets dying of suicide, dying of their own hand, than would have died overseas fighting in those wars. What do you infer from that?
Well, modern warfare is in some respects much more intense than ancient warfare. It's much more prolonged. Famous battles between Athenians and Spartans lasted a number of hours. Modern warfare, when it's unfolding, is just unremitting. And then perhaps people are witnessing more trauma, in part because of our equipment protects people from dying, but they see some pretty terrible things. There's a lot of brain trauma mixed in there with the post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, you know, I think it's pretty fair to say that we have not done as well as we should for our veterans who return home.
Who's we?
Well, if you look at, you know, the health care for veterans, it's not always the finest health care. I don't know what to say about it.
Do you mean psychiatrically? Do you mean in terms of their physical condition? Do you mean in terms of, I presume you mean everything, getting them jobs when they come back, the whole 9 yards?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think we owe it to them to really do our very, very best to help them deal with it. And, you know, we've been, I mean, now, of course, there's a lot of attention being paid to PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. But I also think that we've been somewhat slow to try some of the new treatments that we have with veterans, which are pretty helpful for PTSD as well.
Yeah, let me go back to that original statistic that we put up there, which was 1 in 5 Canadians experiencing mental health issues at some point in their life, and others suggesting it's closer to 1 in 4 or 1 in 3.
Yeah.
Where are you on that scale?
Well, I think Roger is exactly right to say that this is a vexed area, and I think nobody can say with confidence that they can give you a clear answer on this, because there are so many confounding factors. There's, you know, a greater awareness of these things, fashions of diagnosis, people are less stigmatized by admitting to mental illness, so they're more likely to come forward for help. We operationalize diagnoses, so we end up getting people ticking boxes and scoring as having an illness that no psychiatrist would diagnose them as having. There are pressures on people to have a diagnosis for reasons of litigation or to get hands-on resources. There are all sorts of pressures that skew this. And so it's difficult to be absolute about that. But I think what Roger was hinting at was that when there is, he called them subgroups of people who are divorced or alienated from family or don't have a church or so on. I don't know what, I'm not, this is my first visit to Canada, but in England those would not necessarily be subgroups. They would be very large chunks of society.
Very mainstream, isn't it?
And there are a lot of pressures on people that make them very unhappy. And if you have a fundamental lack of, if you're not grounded with a very good self-esteem, then you can easily be derailed and sent into states of anxiety and depression. And I think it just depends what you mean by these terms, and I think we'd all agree that around this table. You can't be adamant about what the level of depression or anxiety is, because it has fuzzy edges. But I think, you know, I would caution against dismissing the idea that these things are on the increase. My experience of older people I live in a rather remote part of the country where there's a slightly more of an old community structure to things. And my impression is that the rates of mental illness are higher amongst the younger people than they were amongst the older people.
Norman, might have been 2 or 3 visits ago that we had you come into the studio to talk about your book on the plasticity of the brain and how the brain changes itself. Can you help us understand how the plasticity in the brain, the constant changing of the brain and how it changes itself, how that helps us understand mental illnesses in the brain?
Sure. You know, plasticity is the property of the brain that allows mental experience to change brain structure and function. And as it first came to light, we were focused on how it can help people get over certain illnesses through certain kinds of focused mental experience. But a changing brain is also, in some respects, a more vulnerable brain to all the mental experiences we have. So what it means is culture can actually alter the brain, and not always for the better.
Culture meaning what?
Well, last evening at Ian's wonderful lecture, we were talking, amongst other things, about digital culture, and a teacher got up, and she worked at the nursery level, and she said this thing which, it's going to sound exaggerated, I know, but she said that she's finding that kids who are coming to nursery in increasing numbers are not good at looking at or reading faces. Now, this is a right hemisphere function.
It is indeed.
And of course, you could write that off as an anecdote, but Ian's had been told about that thing happening all the time, And people are increasingly at very, very early ages going online and looking. I do it with my grandchild, looking at people on Skype, etc.
And that's an explanation for it, you think?
Well, that might just be one example. Look, the key example, I think, is the alteration of our attention spans, particularly for sustained attention.
Exactly.
And that's being driven by the digital age. Another thing that the digital age is driving, I mean, people I think are much more wired because you have this connectivity that's going on 24/7, which means that there's lots and lots of stimulation people are having. Of course, there are many more demands on people at work to be constantly processing tons of things. And this turns on the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight reaction, and increasingly people don't know how to turn it off. They're not returning to normal downtimes. And not only is there more time spent connected, but of course we're connected to remote events, and therefore we hear about a lot of terrible events. And I think people are walking around in a much more wired condition. And that's one of the reasons people are interested in turning to various things of the East and meditation, because it's a groping attempt to come to terms with this. People are also, to some degree, in the information society, often imprisoned in a cubicle. It's not even a cubicle anymore. It's like the 18 inches between you and your computer. And the sedentary lifestyle is making people feel very trapped. It's very bad for the heart and the brain.
I want to get Roger's take on this. Roger, you've heard what Norman has to say about whether this wiring, if I can use that word, into the various machines of our culture is affecting our mental health. What do you think?
Well, a couple of points there. Let me just pick up on what Norman was saying. I think the plasticity argument is well supported. I think Norman has very much communicated this very clearly in his book, and I think Iain also, I suspect, belongs to a camp that would be in belief of the literature on that. And so one of the sort of favorite sort of dinner table or dinner party examples is the taxi cab drivers in London having larger areas of the brain that are for spatial memory and so on. But let me just pick up on this issue of circuits. And it's something that has been curious to us in psychiatry for a long time. It's important to highlight that in psychiatry and neuroscience today, we have over 20,000 reports that have used neuroimaging methodology in the last 2 decades to look at the brain under both normal and abnormal circumstances. And what's interesting is that intuitively, when you think about the brain at rest, when we're awake but at rest, not involved in any kind of task, we would intuit that the brain's really in a kind of a quiet mode, in contradistinction to when we're asked to do a cognitive task or emotional task or a motoric task, where you would expect that it's extremely busy. Well, the reality is that when the brain is in a state of wakefulness, but in quotes at rest, it's actually very, very active. And what's interesting is that the regions of the brain that are very, very active when we're in that quiet state, what William James would have called the stream of consciousness, the inner voice, the inner self, that mind-wandering part where we find our transitional creativity, those brain regions light up when we're in that sort of state of quietness. And they're very, very active. So, and just to go forward with that, if I could, that region is known as the default mode network, the DMN. And many people in the world of neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience now believe that that has relevance to both normal and abnormal human functioning. Here's a wonderful example. We now know that if I ask somebody to think about themselves in the context of themselves, or we make reference to them, or we show them pictures of themselves, this default mode network lights up. So it lights up when we provoke them, but it lights up when they're in this state of sort of quiet, sort of self-reflection. What's interesting is that victims of trauma, of physical and sexual abuse during childhood, a very common complaint to me as a psychiatrist is they feel a sense of inner emptiness, a loss of self, a sense of void. And what's interesting is that the default mode network in these individuals is decreased in its activity. Iain made reference to schizophrenia and autism spectrum and anorexia nervosa. What all of these syndromes share in common is disturbance of the self. And what's interesting is this brain circuit, the default mode network, which is activated during that state of quiet wakefulness, is abnormal. It's underactive in these individuals, perhaps providing a correlate. So I guess the point I'm trying to get across here is that there's no question that the external environment is becoming noisier, faster, and more distractible. But I think we've probably underestimated how active the brain really is when it's in a state of quiet wakefulness. And we're now beginning to learn that these circuits that subserve this experience may be relevant to both normal human function as well as abnormal circumstances like the mental disorders I mentioned.
Understood. Let me take this moment to play some tape. We want to talk about antidepressants, which people take, of course, when they're suffering from mental illness. 60 Minutes, the American television program, did a piece on this recently, and well, we're going to show a little clip here from a piece they did on whether antidepressants actually work. Roll tape, Michael.
So when you did your study, you put all the trials together.
That's right.
You're looking at patients who took the real drug and patients who took the placebo.
Yes.
Did they get equally better? Or did the ones who took the pills get even a little better?
If they were mildly or moderately depressed, you don't see any real difference at all. The only place where you get a clinically meaningful difference is at these very extreme levels of depression.
Now look, psychiatrists say the drug works.
Right.
The drug companies and their scientists say the drug works. Maybe you're wrong.
Maybe. I'd add to that, by the way, patients say the drugs
Patients say the drug
work.
works.
And for the patients and the psychiatrists, it's clear why they would say the drug works. They take the drug, they get better. Our data show that as well.
You're just saying why they get better.
That's right, and the reason they get better is not because of the chemicals in the drug. The difference between drug and placebo is very, very small, and in half the studies, non-existent.
Okay, Ian, to you first. That's obviously a hugely controversial thing to say, which caused a lot of attention.
Yeah.
It suggests, of course, that you, the drug companies, that a whole range of people have no clue about what makes antidepressants work.
Well, the first thing to say is that it behoves us all to be skeptical of the data put out by pharmaceutical companies, and I'm afraid that they don't have a very fine track record of honesty and openness. So I completely understand that, but I'm afraid this is a very crude message. And it's typical of what you get when you aggregate millions of bits of data. You get a fluffy answer that nothing really shows up as significant. But actually, to anybody who has experience of treating people with depression, or as I myself have, both of treating people and of suffering from it, I wouldn't buy this story for a minute.
Let's just, you went by that rather quickly, and I want people just to note, you don't just have clinical experience on this, you yourself suffered from depression many years ago.
Most of my adult life.
Most of your adult life, okay.
And I know very, very well the relationship between taking that medication and getting better. And my first experience of it was actually so dramatic for me. It so completely took me back to a way I hadn't been for years, that it was one of the things, apart from, there were many strands to why I moved from my previous world of lecturing in the humanities to wanting to be a doctor and a psychiatrist, but it was one of the things that impelled me to do so.
Because it worked.
Because it seemed so important, and to be able to do that for other people seemed a very important thing to be able to do.
Norman, can I get you to comment on this notion that psychiatrists, pharmacologists, big pharma don't really understand the nature of depression very well, as Irving Kirsch suggested, and that most of the stuff works just as well with placebo as with the real thing?
Well, there's many things in there. As for the understanding of depression, the emphasis for the last number of years has been focusing on particular chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And one of the things that's happened is about every 7 to 10 years, there's been an alteration in the explanation as to which neurotransmitter is decisive. When I started practice and when Ian started practice, we used drugs that were called dirty drugs because they hit a lot of neurotransmitters. Then they were replaced by ones that focused on serotonin, and then they were replaced by ones that focused on other neurotransmitters. Now, the explanation keeps changing. I do think it's fair to say that whatever depression is, it's much more complicated than someone saying it's an absence of a particular neurotransmitter. Because there's a circuitry question, In Toronto, there was very important research that showed there's a certain circuit in the brain around an area called C25 that in intractable depressions, if you stimulate it or if you give it a certain kind of electrical stimulation.
Where is that?
Roger, where would you see that?
How would you want to describe where C25 is?
Well, the cingulate cortex would be a region in the so-called limbic or the subcortical region,
Yeah.
and it's part of a larger circuit that subserves emotional processing and integrating with cognition.
Okay.
I mean, I'd illustrate it this way. If this is the brain's, if this is the spinal cord, and this is the emotional part of the brain,
Okay.
the cerebral cortex wraps around it like this. So it's kind of deep in the brain, like that.
And if you stimulate that C25,
In some people, in many people with intractable depression, it actually can lift spontaneously. So there's a circuitry component to depression, and then of course there's something that's going on inside in your life
Yes.
that's a component of it. So we've, there's been a message out there that's been very reductionistic, and so some people are reacting to that, and it also turns out that the circuitry for depression is also related to the circuitry for common unhappiness in some respects. So, depression's also about demoralization, but it seems that in some people, at a certain point, it's like a switch is triggered, and then you lock into that, and you just cannot get out of that, and that's the crucial thing. And I mean, I've used medication with patients, and from time to time I've seen the kinds of things that Ian has described. But one thing should be noted about Kirsch. Kirsch is a placebo researcher, and he stumbled upon two really important things that we have to face in psychiatry. The first one is that there were certain changes in how the FDA goes about approving drugs. And he discovered that about 40% of drug trials had basically been suppressed from the public. And because it turns out that those were the trials that showed that medication was not working better than placebo.
I see.
So this is huge.
Yeah.
And for I want to be able to say to patients when I think they need medication that there isn't this kind of scandal in behind. So there's a need for real transparency about this.
Absolutely.
And I'm a doctor, I work for my patient, I don't work for the drug companies. The drug companies have come up with some really important inventions, but one thing that Kirsch has found, and this is something that we really have to think through, is while people can sort of differ about how much better antidepressants are than placebos for depression, placebo rates are pretty high in depression. What happens in a placebo reaction is you expect that you'll get better because the culture and the doctor tells you this pill will work. And so placebo reactions don't just work when you get a sugar pill. They're also working when you get any other kind of intervention. They're working when you get psychotherapy. They're working when you get a medication and your doctor says, I think this will help you.
Because you're expecting that it will.
Yeah, and this is a neuroplastic phenomenon to some degree, right? Because your mental set is somehow triggering certain circuitry. So we've spent billions on investigating drugs. How about throwing a few billion to investigate the placebo, which is making a big contribution to being, it's a way of turning on a circuit.
I'd
Ian,
agree
you
with
wanted to
that.
follow?
I think the really interesting thing here is how powerful a drug placebo is, and that actually lacks an explanation. We have all sorts of hypotheses about how that actually comes about, but it's a fascinating instance of mind interacting with matter. But I just wanted to say I agree wholeheartedly with Norman that the mind and the brain are wondrously complex things. Of course, there are circuits, there are chemicals, there's more connections in the brain than there are known particles in the universe. You can't reduce a human experience to a chemical. But that is, to use that as an argument, and I know Norman is not, but if people think that's any kind of an argument against using an antidepressant, it doesn't get off the starting blocks, because it just is true that certain drugs are able to alter mood. And we don't have any problem in saying that uppers and amphetamines and LSD and E and various other things alter mood. They do. Why should we be so rooted in our objections to the idea that certain marketed chemicals do. But I want to reinforce also that we need much greater transparency and much greater honesty and openness from the pharmaceutical industry.
Roger, I hear you trying to get in.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this. I think this has become such a significant issue in the conversation in psychiatry, and I want to just to touch on a few points. I agree that there has been, I think, a larger discussion around transparency. I agree with Ian on that. I don't think we've actually seen all the data we would like to have seen, and there's been sort of efforts to try and uncover some of this data. I think it's cast a certain mistrust throughout the entire field, and it's had, in my view, a very significant and negative effect. We've seen, for example, a decreased use of antidepressants in younger populations, in kids, for example, in the United States, Canada, and the UK, and that's been associated with an increase in suicide in kids. I would call that a deplorable outcome. Now, let me, in fact, just respond specifically to this, because I think that the public has been perplexed. First, there is, in fact, no such thing as a single type of depression. Depression is probably a final common pathway of many different etiologies and many different causative factors. So just like an infectious disease or like diabetes or cardiovascular disease, there's not going to be one medication or one intervention that's going to be the panacea, the solution. The second point is that just because a medication mitigates the symptoms doesn't mean that the underlying pathoetiology is the opposite of that. In other words, if Tylenol remedies your headache wasn't due to a Tylenol deficiency. So these things don't have to be so linear. The final point along that line is as follows. Going forward, what we have not done and what we're going to do in the field is what's already occurred in other areas like infectious and parasitic diseases. And that is that what we need to understand is the biological basis, that is the so-called biosignature of these conditions. And if we have a more comprehensive, more fuller understanding of what is the underlying biology to these conditions, and I'm going to broaden that to the psychosocial biology of these conditions, then that will position us, I think, in a more strategic way to say, well, this treatment you should get, and that treatment you should not get.
I don't think that's likely to happen, Roger, because as you rightly say, depression is as various as humanity. There are so many different kinds of depression. And this is why I find government guidelines that I'm helpfully given about how to treat depression really are quite by the by, because every single person that comes to me is going to need a different approach. And I suppose one of the problems with these aggregating studies is that you know that certain treatments, including certain antidepressants, won't work with certain people, and you may try them, and you have to try 2 or 3 before you find the one that does work. Now, if you aggregate all those studies, it seems like they don't work very well. But one drug for a certain person works extremely well, and another for another person works extremely well. So that information, which is at the individual, the unique level at which a clinician is operating, gets lost in these studies.
Well, and that's a key point. So there's not going to be one single factor that's going to say, well, because you have this feature of depression or you have a family history, that's going to say you're going to respond to treatment X or not respond to treatment Y. And there's other areas of medicine where this is also played out, in oncology and so on, where the reality is we're going to need several factors, several factors that together in a combinatorial equation increase the probability. They don't guarantee, but increase the probability that you will, in fact, have a desirable outcome.
Yeah, indeed.
And as opposed to the current status quo, where admittedly we're just simply treating things empirically, we don't have any way to guide our treatment.
Well, I just wanted to emphasize this whole issue of guidelines that are drafted out of context is algorithms, and aspects of evidence-based medicine, which many people think is the answer to our woe, is a great example of how left brain, a left brain tendency is trying to, it takes a process that at this point, just because of the level of our knowledge, requires subtlety and a certain degree of art at this point, and sort of box it in. And it's actually really, really problematic, and it has to do with how we train residents too. And so when you get somebody who's experienced, like Dr. McGilchrist, and he's dealing with a patient, he is looking at it, I believe, in a more right-brained, holistic way. And I want to raise in that context the role of psychotherapy, because one of the things that happened is, once upon a time, psychotherapy and maybe electroconvulsive therapy were the major things we had to offer patients. And then as medications became more and more popular, there was a tendency to shift the giving of medication to primary care physicians who have 5, 10, 15 minutes to see patients, and psychotherapy got left out of the equation. And people were increasingly starting to report that depression, which was once, when I was in training, treated as often an episodic illness that lasted from 6 months to 12 months, that's how long you'd use an antidepressant, was increasingly being described as a chronic disease. And that coincided with, it seems to me, giving out antidepressants in the absence of what I think is proper care, which would include psychotherapy, because it's pretty traumatic to experience a depression. And so I really think that we have to really go back to this combined approach and use both the mental and the physical, and understand that something like psychotherapy is a biological intervention insofar as it uses mental activity to also modify brain structure. One's more top-down, one's more bottom-up.
Yeah. Well, let's talk resources here for a second then. Roger, to you first here. In Canada, if I've got the statistics right, there is one psychiatrist for every 8,000 Canadians. In some poorer countries in the world, that ratio is one psychiatrist for every 2 million citizens. Should a country like Canada have more psychiatrists?
Well, I think when you look at what's considered an ideal ratio, certainly the ratios we have in Canada, we'd always like to see more. But I think, if I could just pick up on that number, if you look at the province of Ontario, and you look at, that's where, certainly the majority of psychiatrists are in the province of Ontario. When you actually look at the practice pattern of psychiatrists, and this has been looked at now for a while, and there's been some recent data now here in Ontario, that psychiatrists, even the newly graduated psychiatrists, tend to fill their practices very quickly. And there tends to be an overrepresentation of patients that they see on a high frequency. That is, they're offering ongoing treatment to. Now, there's going to be differences of opinion on this, frankly, but I don't think we're ever going to have enough psychiatrists in Canada. When you look at the prevalence rate of mental illness in Canada, if you take 4,000 psychiatrists in Canada and you multiply that by 40 hours a week, you're at 160,000 hours in a year. We've got almost 1 million people with mental illness in the country. So I think that the whole model of healthcare delivery needs to be looked at. We've not got enough psychiatrists, and I think there's been really not just lip service, but I think there's been examples where collaborative models working with allied health professionals, particularly in primary care, where the psychiatrist clearly serves as someone who is an expert in the area of mental health and mental disorders, but works more collaboratively in the delivery of that care. It's just not feasible, given the number of psychiatrists we have, number of hours in a week, for psychiatrists to really take on all these individuals. Moreover, the current practice pattern is one where things are not going to change anytime soon.
Well, let me go to Ian on that one. They say when you want to alleviate traffic congestion, you build more highways. But in effect, they get congested just as quickly, and what you've just done is created more traffic. Is it the same thing with psychiatrists? If we doubled the number of psychiatrists tomorrow, would we suddenly be seeing lots more people coming forward with mental illnesses, and we wouldn't be any further along, actually?
Well, we'd be further along because they'd be getting treated. There's definitely an undersupply, and it's very marked in Britain. The National Health Service, which I think is a wonderful institution, is completely overwhelmed by the need for mental health services and finds it hard to provide ongoing treatment for people. It tends to focus on the most severely mentally ill. They have to be prioritized, that's absolutely right. But there's a tendency to think of other people who may have absolutely life-crippling ongoing illnesses of anxiety, depression or addiction as somehow they'll just have to get by with whatever the GP gives them. And so, no, we desperately need more psychiatrists. It's not a situation in which we can afford to allow things to go, if I'm right that people are suffering more than they used to.
In which case, just a few minutes left here. Norman, if you could wave that magic wand over the Ministry of Health's budget here in Ontario, $47 billion budget, Not all of it, obviously, for mental health, but how would you reallocate existing spending? Because we know we're not going to spend more going forward. How would you reallocate the way
I'm not an expert
spending?
in that. I think we could use some more psychiatrists. I wouldn't want to see psychiatrists just become people who do assessments and maybe prescribe medication only and become separate from the mind. I mean, I think another area that might be helpful in the long haul would be where plasticity might offer some assistance is, look, the model, and Ian has shown this, I've talked about this a lot, the model that people have had of the brain is seen it as a machine. And you would come to the psychiatrist and with a broken machine. And the psychiatrist's job is to fix it. And the patient actually, to some degree, is left out of the process. The patient is put into a passive process. But now that we know that mental experience is very much involved in changing brain structure, I think what we have to focus our attention on is ways, and some of these things can be done in groups too. Like Ian and I have both had wonderful experience for patients where
Some of these things can be done better, actually, in groups.
yes, where meditation is involved for maintaining people for depression and so on, where the patient's brought more actively into their own treatment. I think that as we develop those techniques, and that's with brain exercises, that's with, but I really think for psychiatry to remain humane and in touch with what we do, we need a number of people who aren't just managers, but are like the psychiatrist you would want to go to if you had a problem.
Steve?
I'm down to, Roger, I'm down to my last minute here, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think the other sort of, it's more of a, at this point, a conceptual issue, Steve, but something I think we should reify and concretize and make as an action plan in the field of psychiatry. We spend too much time on treating mental illness. We don't spend any time talking about preventing mental illness. And we're not going to have enough psychiatrists in Canada, full stop. We're not going to have it. And so we accept that reality. And every area of medicine, they talk about prevention, except in psychiatry. There's already examples where, for example, women leaving hospitals with newborn babies at risk of depression, rates of 10% of postpartum depression. If we visit them within 4 weeks of leaving the hospital with careful screening for depression, we can actually reduce some of the burden of depression. The implications for mom and the baby are enormous. So I think conceptually we need to move into prevention. That's the strategic direction to deal with this serious problem of mental illness.
We got to do that across every discipline in healthcare, quite frankly. But anyway, so much for that editorial comment. Thanks, everybody, so much for joining us tonight for this very important discussion. Roger McIntyre, the psychiatry and pharmacology guy at the University of Toronto, thanks for being there for us on the Rock from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Thank you.
Norman Doidge, the psychiatrist here in Toronto, author of The Brain That Changes Itself, and Iain McGilchrist, the author of The Master and His Emissary. I'm never going to look at the left and the right hemispheres of my brain the same way again.
I hope not.
Thanks to your lecture last night, and we look forward to seeing that actually in the first weekend of May on TVO's Big Ideas program. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.